Next lecture is going to go ahead and cover the lead up to World War II, as well as what does it look like when the United States actually goes ahead and enters the war itself in those early years. There will be another one next week that really deals with the conclusion of the war and what does it look like actually after the war ends. What's the world look like as the United States kind of jumps into a new role as a superpower? So we'll cover that later on, but this one's really just focused on what does it look like before the U.S. gets involved and then after they get involved? What's the home front really look like? So a little bit of review. Again, World War II. You guys have seen nothing but TV shows, movies, video games that deal with World War II in some way, shape, or form. The reason is that World War II is ultimately the most destructive war in history. You're talking about more than 40 million people dying as a result of conflicts happening all across the world, and more than half of those are actually civilians, including about 6 million Jewish people and many others are killed in the Holocaust. Um, and if you're talking about a U.S. perspective, well, at the end of the war, the U.S. actually emerges into the position we are today, which is the strongest nation in the world, the world's superpower essentially. And the thing that kind of helps them get to that is not only did the war happen, but you also possess the most powerful weapon in human history, an atomic bomb. So the impact today, again, World War II really puts the U.S. in a position to be a superpower, to be the world's leader economically, politically, militarily. Um, and then that last note there, again, you're talking about wartime production shifts the United States into a global manufacturing hub. And it would remain that way for a very long time. It's not so much a thing nowadays, but for a very long time, the United States really had a ton of blue collar manufacturing jobs, including the auto industry, which we'll talk about later on. But nevertheless, again, the war is a monumental event that really changes the game for the United States and the whole world. So again, here's just a quick timeline. I'm not going to go over in too much detail. Basically, you have Hitler and Mussolini forming an alliance in the early 30s. Hitler kind of expands his power and his reach in Europe throughout the late 1930s. The U.S. really doesn't kind of get on board until after Pearl Harbor, 1941. And then from there on, that's where you're getting into the big thick of it in terms of the war, leading all the way up till 1945. So, United States. This is talking about prior to the war. You're talking about mid to late 1930s. Where is the United States? Right? Hitler's expanding his power throughout Europe. You have the rise of fascism, totalitarianism in both Hitler and Mussolini. You got the rise of Imperial Japan. What's the United States doing this entire time? Well, they still want to remain neutral. You're talking about isolationist ideas becoming even stronger in the early 30s. Again, this is the time period the Great Depression is still happening. So there's a big debate in the United States of what should we be doing? We understand there is the rise of these powerful dictators out in Europe as well as Imperial Japan, but we really need to focus on what's going on at home. Part of that's the Nye Committee, which is a government committee that was formed to actually analyze the profits made by uh, arms manufacturers and um, military suppliers during World War One, and really kind of came to a conclusion that um, the amount of profits and big business being conducted during World War One actually kind of influenced U.S. involvement in the war coming up in 1918. So while we understand that World War One is a complicated thing, and the United States is involved in multiple reasons, the Nye Committee does come to a conclusion that well, profits based off arms sales was kind of a big component of that. So after that's all kind of wrapped up, you have the Neutrality Acts of 1935 and 1937, which are really putting it in black and white ink, saying the United States really needs to stay out of this. All right, we need to focus here on the domestic side of things, not get involved in another global conflict. So yes, the United States wants to remain neutral, and they do so for many years. However, you see kind of the cracks in the facade start to form starting in 1939. This is where you're getting into the Neutrality Act, where cash and carry basis for arms sale with Britain and France. So the United States won't get involved in the war per se. They will say, hey, Britain and France, we will sell you arms, but you have to actually go ahead and give us payment immediately. We will not loan them to you. And on top of that, we will not ship them to you. All right, you have to actually transport those arms yourselves. On top of that, 1940 rolls around, and the United States says, hey, we will give the British Navy old American destroyers in exchange for the land rights to build American bases on British-controlled Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the islands of the Caribbean. So again, you see the military footprint of the United States start to expand more. Right, we will give you our military technology in exchange for more military bases in the future. Again, timeline kind of moves a little bit further. You have the Lend-Lease Act. Well, the U.S. will be able to lend or lease arms to any country considered vital to the defense of the United States. So this is, again, what are they defining as a country considered vital? Well, you're getting into a position where it's pretty much the Allies. So you're talking about France and Britain and similar countries who are fighting the axis of Germany and Italy at the time. You also get to a position where the U.S. is saying, hey, actually the western half of the Atlantic was part of the Western Hemisphere and therefore is neutral. All right, so if anything is kind of going on, even in a 1,000-mile radius, that the U.S. could be technically justified in defending itself. So this is talking about the U.S. Navy patrolling the Western Atlantic and reveal location of German subs to the British. So it's all in the guise of, well, the United States is just protecting the United States. But in doing so, we'll pass some intel on to the British. So again, you're starting to blur the line of neutrality. Are they really neutral? Well, I mean, a lot of their actions aren't necessarily living up to that in a pure sense. Again, they haven't declared war on anybody, but for the most part, they're doing a lot of things to help the Allies without actually getting involved in the war specifically. So again, you move forward down the timeline. So you're talking about late 1930s, early 1940s now. Well, you have escalating tensions on two ends. The first end, you have escalating tensions in Germany. And you're talking about September 1941. A German U-boat actually fired on an American ship, radioing the U-boat's position to the British. So that previous slide we were talking about, hemispheric defense zones. Well, Germans find out about that, and they go ahead and fire on the ship. FDR responds, and he says, well, if they're going to fire on us, they shot first. All right, now we can go ahead and shoot on sight with German subs. A month later, October 1941, Germans target 2 American destroyers and actually blow up a couple of them. Again, you're starting to get to a point where really can you stay out of the war at this point when you've not only helped the Allies so much, but now you're actually being attacked by the Nazis themselves. On the other hand, you have Japan. Remember, World War II fought in two fronts. You're talking about in Europe and in the Pacific. Well, on one hand, Britain needed to keep most of its navy in Asia to protect their interests there from Japan, so you have a large presence in the Pacific. And then as Germany kept taking out British ships, the British had to pull some of their Southeast Asia to the Atlantic. All right, you're talking about taking some of those military presence from the Pacific, and you need to shift them to the Atlantic. So then somebody has to fill that void. That's where FDR comes in hand. He says, well, I'm going to introduce policies that discourage Japanese from attacking the British Empire. All right, again, those relationships with the British are very, very, very strong. So again, you might remain neutral on paper, but your actions are saying something else. Again, escalating tensions in Japan. July 1940 rolls around. You have the Export Control Act. FDR has the power to restrict the sale of strategic materials to other nations. So what does he do? Well, he blocks the sale of airplane fuel and scrap iron to Japan. Two crucial things you need for your military. 1941, you begin sending Lend-Lease aid to China in an effort to assist the Chinese in preventing the Japanese from attacking elsewhere. It doesn't work, but nevertheless, all the actions are pointing to one side rather than the other. So, you kind of further down the timeline a little bit more. FDR responds by freezing all Japanese assets in the U.S., reduce the amount of oil being shipped to Japan, and he's sending kind of one of the top generals in the U.S. military, Douglas MacArthur, to the Philippines to build up American defenses there. Well, Japan responds directly back. Their war in China, their expansionism in Asia is actually in jeopardy because they need oil, like critically need oil and other resources. So what do? Well, they want to attack resource-rich British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. They want to seize the Philippines and ultimately attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. So there you go, Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, day will live in infamy. The result of it was about 2,500 people are killed. You're talking about massive, massive, massive damage to U.S. ships and planes and the whole naval base actually at Pearl Harbor itself. The good news was that actually U.S. aircraft carriers and 7 destroyers were actually on maneuvers out at sea, and the American fleet and submarine bases and actual fuel facilities survived the attack. So while damage was pretty hefty, again, the objective of taking out the entire Pacific Fleet actually failed. So the very next day, U.S. actually declares war on Japan. Japan's allies, remember, they formed a pact, Germany, Italy, and Japan, as the Axis powers declared war on the U.S. 3 days later, December 11th. So now, officially, the U.S. is in World War II.